My brother stole my comic thunder. He did. This is not funny. It's really not funny.
I doubt that.
No, it isn't. It isn't.
Well, you'll just have to do a little ad-libbing.
All right. My dad, Victor Marshall Fenn, died over 4 years ago on December 10th, 2014, at the age of 91. He made it very clear he didn't want a formal funeral after he died. Most of his friends were already gone, and Mom's dementia was becoming a problem, so we decided to put it off. But it always felt wrong not to do anything to celebrate and acknowledge the rather spectacular man that my dad was. Sorry. Albert thought that was funny. Keep doing that, please. Okay, heckle me. So I am very happy we are doing that today, and I thank you for joining us. All right, the rest. Okay. Boy.
Do you want to get Albert up there with you?
She's good.
She's okay.
Thank you, GT. Victor was born in London, England on November 30th, 1923. He would have been 96 today. He left school. This is so stupid. Okay, hold on.
And don't give up. Keep going. You're doing
Really?
good.
He left school, Heil Hitler. He left school at the age of 11 to start working as a delivery boy for the London Daily Mail. His father was a circulation manager for the paper. Soon after he turned 15, the Second World War broke out, and Victor couldn't wait to join the Air Force. He even lied about his age on the application to get in. He was part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which I just learned yesterday, which took thousands of young men to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand for pilot training. Dad was sent to Canada and trained in Quebec and Alberta. And before you could say, can you believe how young he was? Victor was an RAF fighter pilot flying Mustangs and Spitfires in World War II. Dad didn't talk a lot about the war, but he did tell us that many of his colleagues were killed during the war or even in training, including one of his best friends who crashed his plane while showing off for his mother. Victor earned the nickname Fearless Fenn and stayed in the RAF briefly after the war. In total, he served from 1942 to 1946 in Europe, India, Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. In 1948, he returned to Canada at the age of 25 with $50 in his pocket. Unhindered by the British class system he loathed and left behind, he reinvented himself in Canada. He brought his natural talent as a writer to a career in advertising and PR, and began with BP Oil, remember those green and white BP stations, and the TD Bank. Dad loved working for companies with green and white logos. That's my only joke.
It's a good one.
Keep repeating it.
Throw it in whenever.
Yeah, just yeah. Green companies. Green and white companies.
In 1955, he launched his own company, Marshall Fenn Limited. Marshall was actually Dad's middle name, but my mom thought Marshall Fenn sounded better than Victor Fenn Limited. In its heyday, Marshall Fenn Limited occupied the second and third floors of 245 Davenport Road, just west of Avenue Road. When I first watched the show Mad Men, I was stunned by the physical similarities between the office of Marshall Fenn Limited and that of Don Draper. Dad also had a typing pool in the center of his office full of attractive young women smoking cigarettes and opaque glass panels beside the wood office doors. His own office was almost identical to Don Draper's, with attractive modern leather couches, modern paintings, and a Scotch bar with whiskey, ice buckets, and cigars. Dad also had a red convertible, but unlike the Draper family, we didn't leave our litter behind after picnics. As CBC host and advertising guru Terry O'Reilly recently confirmed to me, your father was very much one of Canada's original madmen. We lived on the upper floor of a house on Lowther Avenue near hippie Yorkville until I was 2. Then in 1965, he bought his first house on Edgewood Crescent in Rosedale, where many of you here today lived as well. Representing Edgewood today, we have Nigel Smith and David and Andrew Ainsworth and Chris Oliver and the Doigs. Mary and Dominique Doig are here. Indirect representation from Amanda and Albert because they were friends with the Dashwoods on that street, which we didn't learn till much later. Dad loved to tell the story of how terrified he was of buying the house. What have I done? Have I lost my mind? I just bought a house for $10,000. Edgewood was a magical place to grow up. It was a dead-end street, and almost every house had kids our age. We all played together on the street for years. Hide and seek, Red Rover, war with neighboring Jean Street. There were urine bombs. When I was 10 years old, Dad moved the family to Binsgarth Road, several blocks away, which enraged me until we got a pool. Also, the Ainsworth family bought our house on Edgewood, which meant I got to play spin the bottle with Mark and Andrew. Dave was too cool to play. My parents did a lot of entertaining in the 70s and 80s, including some killer pool parties once we moved to Binsgarth. Paul was older and stayed up later than me and filled me in later on some of the shenanigans he witnessed from the second floor window, including drunken skinny dipping. Not looking at you, Marilyn Vasil-Chiati.
Honestly, I've never seen it. Not for lack of trying.
In 1978, Dad sold Marshall Fenn Limited. A few years later, he and my mom traveled the world for a year, visiting family and long-lost friends from Europe to New Zealand to Malaysia. Shortly after returning, they shocked us and their friends by buying a house in Northumberland County on a whim. The property was called Windermere, a stunning 150-year-old stone house near Rice Lake with 40 acres of rolling hills and a beautiful swimming and/or skating pond. Interestingly, Windermere is about a 10-minute crow flight from where my friends Albert and Leslie have a farm, and Ambrose and Patricia are now living, and Dominique and Bruce also live. It's where I met my dear friend Rebecca Whitman, whose genetically modified family lived up the hill. I fell in love with Windermere and Northumberland County and headed out there by train, with Paul or without, almost every weekend for years. My parents lived at Windermere for 13 years, and it was the happiest time as a family, in my opinion. Dad and I explored the area on long walks or cross-country skiing. It was heaven. My parents became snowbirds, wintering in San Miguel de Allende, where I believe during Sears, and her husband visited them. Every year they rented a different villa, each one as stunningly beautiful as the last. Eventually they started going to Sarasota, Florida, where Sandy Ball and her family had a place. And one night we ran into Jamie and Andrew in a restaurant, which shocked us all. I mean, it's just such a small world. Windermere is where Victor began to pursue his lifelong dream of being a real writer. He wrote at least 3 books that I know of while he was there. He was very secretive about his writing. I wasn't allowed to tell anybody. And I know he got close to having at least one of them published. But he detested rewriting and editing and would move on to his next inspiration, which is not at all familiar. Wherever he and my mother went, Dad was always working on something. Even in San Miguel, he wrote humor pieces for the local paper. Being a writer is like being a student. You can never really relax. You always have homework. A writer's work is always there, waiting for you to return to it. The sooner you finish something, another idea comes along, and it won't go until you attend to it. Eventually, Dad felt too isolated living out at Windermere, and again, to my chagrin, they moved, this time to Port Hope, where they lived for 15 years or more. For the first time since the war, Dad had a group of male friends. He and his buddies met for a weekly pub lunch for years. until Victor was more or less the last one standing. When the stairs in their Port Hope home became too treacherous, they moved to the condo townhouse in Coburg, which Paul and I are hanging on to by our fingernails until further notice. Victor Fenn was a contradiction. One of the most peaceful men I've ever known, whose years as a fighter pilot in World War II were the happiest of his life. One of the most witty, erudite people I've ever known, who had the equivalent of a grade 8 education. A deeply creative, funny man who often came across as strict and humorless. A man who drank too much but whom I never saw drunk. A relatively wealthy, generous man who couldn't spend money on himself. A man who retired at the age of 55 but never stopped working. A man nicknamed Fearless Fenn, who admitted to me that almost everything he'd done in his life was motivated by fear. A highly successful, truly self-made man who often thought of himself as a failure. Should I not say that? I know he wouldn't like it, but he'd also hate it if all we did was sing his praises. Like most British-born wasps, he loathed attention of any kind. His biggest fear was embarrassment. As a businessman, he eventually overcame his fear of public speaking, but he never lost his discomfort with public displays of affection, which is why part of my stand-up comedy routine includes the line, "Wasps are people who can only show love and affection to animals." My dad was one of the only people I've ever met who actually hated massage. Although I think he let Marilyn massage him. Yes, that was a legendary story. Anyway, I always felt my father loved me, but when it came to physical or verbal gestures, things just got awkward. I lost count of the number of times he crushed his reading glasses trying to give me a solid hug. When I was in my late 30s, I just decided to start saying, "Daddy, I love you" to him, something we'd never done as a family. But eventually he intervened. "Annie," he said, "I appreciate the sentiment. However, I'm concerned that if repeated too often, the words will lose their meaning." So from then on, whenever I felt like saying, "Daddy, I love you," I told him to go fuck himself. Oh, I did have a joke. Cats, however, were another species. Victor loved cats and cats loved Victor. Our cat, Charlie, bit anyone who came near him, except for my dad. I was terrified of Charlie, who would sleep on Dad's lap for hours, purring as Dad read the paper and rubbed his tummy. Victor was his own worst critic, which is part of what made him so extraordinary. Creative people are like that, I've learned. Creativity and the critic share the same brain, unfortunately, which explains the often painful existence of most writers. It doesn't help that the inner critic is often right, as second, third, and eighth drafts often prove. As I've learned the hard way, the only way to shut down your critic is to do your work, which my dad knew well. He wrote his first book in his late 50s and his last at the age of 87. A well-researched and entertaining nonfiction book that challenged what he called the cult of positive thinking. Because Dad was such a natural-born skeptic, I jokingly called his book The Joy of Negative Thinking. I know it was hard for Dad to never be published. It's hard to get published, but the truth is publishing companies prefer to invest in younger writers. Not only are they seen to be sexier, they're more likely to have a lucrative career than an unknown writer in his 80s. Still, I know it stung, and it's why I hope to get one of my own stupid books published one day. I'll do it for Victor. Ooh. Given how sensitive my father was as a man, I can only imagine him as a boy. Every now and then he would tell me about how painfully shy he was as a child, marveling at how far he'd come. But extreme shyness wasn't his only handicap. He was also left-handed and seriously dyslexic, so dyslexic that he learned to write using a mirror. Wow. This must have been part of why he quit school at the age of 11. His education also included elocution lessons, which his mother forced him to take so that he'd have a chance to rise above his family's lower class status. He hated those lessons, but given England's class system at the time, I don't blame his mother for trying to give him a leg up, and he didn't either. Dad was one of the most thoughtful, intellectually curious, erudite people I've ever met. He never stopped reading, educating himself, playing chess with his electric chess set, teaching himself French, then Spanish, staying up late trying to figure out existential problems. It was normal to find him late at night sitting alone in the dark. "What are you doing?" I'd ask. "Thinking," he'd say, happy as a clam. "Annie, why do you think we're here?" he'd ask. He didn't claim to know, but he never stopped trying to figure it out. He was raised a Christian, Paul, but he didn't take us to church, something he later regretted when he realized how ignorant Paul and I were about the basic foundations of our own culture. He told me that if he had to choose a religion, he would have been Buddhist. He loathed people calling themselves atheists because he thought it was arrogant. How can we say there is no greater power in the universe? Our perspective is always limited by our own humanity. The truth is, we just don't know. Amen to that. Dad discovered exercise around the age of 40 when he was diagnosed with angina after his business lunches and my mother's amazing cooking caught up with him. He began to walk to work every day from our house on Edgewood Crescent, a 40-minute walk which baffled our neighbors at first, and they would pull over and offer him a lift, which he would politely turn down. As a teenager, I adopted his passion for walking. We often went on long walks, sometimes all the way to By the Way Cafe in the Annex for frozen yogurt. Our tradition continued at Windermere Farm, where we explored the landscape of Northumberland County for hours at a time, talking nonstop. When they moved to Port Hope, we would walk out of town to the farm fields lining Lakeshore Road, where Amanda Schultz now lives. Dad continued to walk for an hour a day until he was almost 90. It was during our walks that I really got to know my dad, who he was, his life experience, what he knew, felt, and believed. I only realized after he was gone how much I took his wealth of knowledge for granted. He was my personal encyclopedia, philosopher, and wise elder, and I loved to pick his brains. When he died, I immediately missed his mind. It was painful to realize I couldn't talk to him anymore.
Oh my God.
I still find myself wishing I could have downloaded his mind onto my computer. It just feels like such a waste. His curious, brilliant mind is gone. Or is it? Some of you may have heard my literally incredible story about my father and my computer that happened a few months after his death. One night I was on the phone with Leslie, very much in the thick of grieving. I hung up, feeling the relief that a good cry brings. Went into my office and sat down at my computer to check my email. As soon as I sat down, photos of my father started popping up on my computer screen, one after another. Many photos I hadn't seen before or in years. And no, it wasn't the result of some kind of inadvertent search. I'm too inept to label my photos. That wouldn't have even worked if I'd tried. It was a completely random, unexplainable event. And yet not. The photos kept coming for about a minute until my entire computer screen was filled with them. I tried to click on them to make them disappear or minimize them. Nothing worked. They wouldn't go away. I sat staring at them for several minutes, absorbing the message. After about 5 minutes, I was finally able to click them away. He might be gone physically, but not yet. Oh.
Sorry.
You're
Almost
fine.
catch you a fly.
I can't tell you how lucky I feel to have had a father who was so thoughtful, humble, funny, and gentle. I never heard him yell.
I did. Please continue.
To this day, I am inspired by his creativity, intelligence, curiosity, diligence, wisdom, and humor. There aren't a lot of men like Victor in the world. One night when I was 15, we were having one of our wonderful intellectual conversations. in the living room after dinner, and he cried out, "Annie, you're a writer!" "I am?" "Yes," he said. "You have the mind of a writer. You just don't have anything to write about yet." It turned out he was right, and I thank him for that. I also thank him for laughing at me. He loved my sense of humor. He ate it up. It's hard to be funny without an audience. I had my friends, but he was my adult audience, encouraging me every step of the way. It's all his fault. I also thank him for his concerted efforts to ensure that Paul and I stay friends as adults. Dad took pains to ensure fairness between us financially and otherwise, and strongly promoted the idea of sibling harmony. And it worked. Neither of my parents was close to their siblings, especially my dad. His brother Marshall was 9 years older, and although we visited him at his hotels in Ireland and Jersey a few times, I know that Dad longed for a closer relationship that never happened. I lost count of the number of times Dad told me how much it meant to him that Paul and I were friends. I honestly think he considered it one of his proudest achievements.
Only took 20 years.
And given the way Paul treated me in childhood, it is pretty remarkable.
Glad to see you've let that go.
Of course, Lily and Gigi make it a no-brainer. Two fantastic young women. Get that, Lily? Young women. Yes. Whom I adore. They have completed our nearly non-existent family, made my life and hair much better. Lily's a hairdresser. And helped turn Paul into the brother I always wanted. Dad and I talked about everything, well, almost everything. He was remarkably liberal and open-minded. My dad was the first person I ever heard refer to sexual orientation as being on a spectrum. "Everyone falls somewhere on it," he said. He might have even used the word fluid. He was prescient about many things, including the perilous future of the planet. In the late 60s, Dad joined Pollution Probe, one of Canada's first nonprofit environmental organizations. When I was still in my 20s, he told me that privacy would soon be something we told our grandchildren about. In the mid-90s, he predicted that by 2025, Canada would be part of the USA. Let's hope he wasn't that smart. I have a few words here to share from some of Dad's former colleagues at Marshall Fenn, starting with David Butler, who bought the agency from my father. David was very sad he couldn't be here today. He had a family reunion. He did, however, send us several excerpts from his personal memoir that included information about my dad and Marshall Fenn Limited. He writes, "Victor and I had a terrific relationship. He was a calming and steady influence on me and the company. I did my best to persuade him to stay on as chairman on any terms he chose, but he could not be budged. I really missed his presence in the office after he left." David wasn't alone. I worked briefly as a secretary at Marshall Fenn during university, and one of his secretaries told me she missed my dad a lot and that she had never heard anyone say anything negative about my father. David Butler wrote, "I'm sorry to miss an opportunity to toast your parents. I will treasure my memories of Victor Fenn and will be ever grateful for the many opportunities he opened up for me. Your dad played an important role in my life as well as career, and your mom was a star on the social scene." Arthur Lightbourne, another Marshall Fenn executive, wrote, "Victor was an extraordinary man. I liked his combination of the cool former British World War II fighter pilot and the astute businessman. I enjoyed working for and with him. A good guy, a classy guy. He is missed." Another former Marshall Fenn executive wrote, "I would rate Victor as one of the best men I worked with. He gave me my start in the advertising business and was always encouraging and patient presence in the agency. I can remember when we flew down to Montreal once, we talked about his flying career in the RAF during the war. He wanted very badly to fly Spitfires, quote, those beautiful machines, he called them, and was thrilled when he got through flight school and was assigned to a Spitfire squadron in the Far East. He told me one of the greatest pleasures was getting his Spitfire up 5,000 or 8,000 feet above the lush tropical landscape and just drifting along with the wonderful Merlin engine humming away, the sun beating down through his canopy, just needing a touch now and then on the stick to keep it straight and level. He said, I felt at peace with the world at those moments. A good man indeed. And let's not forget he helped liberate Europe. As Maya Angelou said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I agree. My dad may not have been able to say it out loud, but he made me feel truly, deeply loved. As you may have noticed, it's hard being human. But family and friends who love and appreciate us not only make it easier, they help us answer the question, why are we here? So thank you all for coming today to help us celebrate our parents. It means so much to us that you came. Let's raise a glass to Victor and Kay.
Cheers.
All right, now please go devour all the cheese.